In this demonstration, we're going to be looking at some of the input element helpers that help you build a form in MVC. Starting off in our dog application that we've been using so far, here is the dog class that sets up some of the fields that we're going to be using for our application. As you can see, we have some integers like ID, strings name, string gender, and so forth. But what you also see is that we're using attributes that are sprinkled above the actual property that we're calling. Here we have required, we have range, and required a few more places. There are some other things you can do in terms of sprinkling attributes on this. You can also use like data type, which is the equivalent of a UI hint. So you can say data type dot, we'll just pretend that this is actually currency right now. And all that really does is that it's meant to serve as a hint for formatting the data in a scaffolded UI. So when you do a strongly typed view and have it automatically created, like say by Entity Framework, UI hints will help when it's rendered out. So it's like it tries to format it for a currency and so forth, as opposed to just a normal number. But for this exercise, we'll take that out and we'll just restart that as the way it was. Okay, so this is our model object that we're using, and the only kind of special stuff we have down here is in terms of our validation. Basically, a dog cannot be spayed if he's a male, and a dog can't be neutered if the gender is female. So that's part of our in-model validation that we have here. So let's go over to our form and start from there. So first off, we'll start with our edit form, which this is pretty straightforward for MVC. As you can see, we've got our begin form that will kick off the start of our form. At the very top, we have our validation summary, which will push out this text along with any of the fields that have issues beneath them. Here we have our standard field set. We have our legend, which very, very common in building these forms in a HTML5 friendly format. In here we have a label, which is doing a label for the actual name, and we're passing in the dog name here. As you can see, that we're overriding the label text of that within the label for method. Now, typically what you'll have sometimes is if you have a display name that is coming from our model here, for instance, if you do like display, you're using the display class and have a name in there, and say you're pulling from a resource file, whatever you put here in the model will actually come out when you do a strongly typed, doing like label for model.name, for instance. If you leave it at that, it'll pull whatever the display name is coming from the model. So this would actually come out to like name if you had that in the back end. So, you know, it's good stuff. For now, we're just going to leave dog name in there, override our label. And some people wonder why we actually use like a label for opposed to just writing HTML like this, where we just say dog name. Well, and the reason why we use our HTML helpers like label for and editor for and so forth is so that we can do things like this, where we bind these directly to the model, and then all the work is done back here in the model. And you know, another argument could be, well, okay, that's fine, but what if I only have this in one place? Yes, that's true. You technically could still do this, but do this where you create the label explicitly like this. But the issue would be that if you ever want to have your application support different languages, you know, this is pretty difficult when you have freehand text like this all over your application, and then the powers that be tell you, you know, I want this in Spanish all of a sudden, and your only option really would be to run it through a translator app like Babelfish or something to that nature. But if all your names are coming out of your model from an attribute here that is, say, tied to a resource file, then you'd be in good shape, because then all you would have to do is switch out the resource file with, say, like the Spanish equivalent, and it would pull the same model from here, and you would not have to update your edit or create pages or anywhere else where you're calling that particular field from the model. So for now, we're just going to leave our HTML helper in there for our label 4. And let me remove that there. So the first one we're going to look at is actually a text box. Here we have the basic form that was spit out. It's using HTML.editor4 and then our model-name. This is the equivalent of HTML.textbox for model.name. So these two are identical, and because what's happening is editor 4 is more of a generic HTML helper where it actually depends on the model to render out the right HTML form element, which in this case is going to be a text box. But because we know that the name is a string and is going to be a text box, we can explicitly say it's a text box 4 to render out. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out the editor 4, and we'll leave text box 4 in there. So what this is saying is this is the equivalent, another equivalent of HTML.textbox instead of 4. So we're going to do loosely typed here, and it's got the string name of name. And this would come in handy where if, say for instance, in our edit, we were going to get the name back from the database of like Max. Well, the text box 4, when you bind it to the model, not only does it have the correct name of your field you're bringing back, but it also brings back the value too. So if you wanted to do the equivalent of that in just a normal text box, if you needed a different name, it would be like model.name. That's one way. Or if this was like the create screen, you could just simply type in Max and pass the value. So, you know, as you can see that there are several different ways to get your input fields to the end user, and it all depends on your web application that you're making there. In some cases, or in most cases I should say, your text box 4, your editor 4, where you explicitly bind it to the model, are going to be just fine. If you have some instances where you actually have the same field that's going to be used in like some partial views along with the parent view, if you will, sometimes you have to have different names that'll be slightly off. So like say for instance, we had a little partial view that we're using for a modal window. Well, we need the same field to show up, but we need to save it slightly differently. So, you know, we could prefix it like that and then still have the same value in the main model.name just like that. So, okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our text box here that we've been talking about for our model name and see how this renders out in the browser. So go ahead and hit save for here. Make sure everything's saved. And we're going to look at our application here. So what we're going to be doing is going into the edit screen and checking out the HTML that renders out. So let's just choose Marty, our first dog here. I'm going to right click on it, view source, scroll down and find our name. So here's our dog name. So here you can see the label that automatically came out using our label 4. It automatically put in 4, so it ties it to our input field here. And you can see all this data dash something. What all this is, right here, I think I got all of it highlighted here. That is all HTML5 goodness right there. That is automatically generated from MVC on your behalf to deal with HTML5 type of validation and other things that it's doing behind the scenes on your behalf, again, with JavaScript and client-side validation. So it's very good stuff, and it's nice that it does that on your behalf to do that. So here, oh, I apologize, that was actually the hidden field, but what you can see is the HTML5 is spitting that out for everywhere. So here we have the actual name field that gets put out, It is a text box, which you can see right here. Type text. The name's the name, so it's the ID. Our validation, which is coming out of our model, is right. That's the required, and our length for that is right here. And the actual value, just standard HTML, is coming across as Marty right there. So with the model validation, if I took that out, you can guess what's going to happen. It will say, please correct the following problems, which that is our validation summary, which is right here at the top. And the next thing is saying name is required. That is coming from this validation message right here. And you notice that it doesn't specify what to actually say for the validation message. This is where that model comes into play. So if we hop back over to our dog model, we'll see that on top of the name is required. What we could do is get a little more specific on this, and we could change the message here if we wanted to. So let me take it out of debug mode here and say something a little bit different. The dog name is required, sir. You just assume everybody is a guy that's visiting your site. So with that assumption, we're just going to go ahead and run it again. We'll change our little message here, just showing that this originates from the model. So back in dog list, go into edit Marty. We'll take that out and hit save. And you see that the name is actually changed here. So that is very nice because this is totally pulling out of our model class, and we can control everything from the model. So where this really comes in nicely is that one model can support multiple views across MVC. It's very common. So like here we have dog, the dog class, and you could have it, as many different forms as you needed, but you only need the error message in one place, so it's easily updated. And if you use a resource file to actually supply the text, that's even better situation for doing language translation and so forth down the road. Okay, so now that we saw your basic text box using the editor for, we can look at the radio buttons a little bit and see how they're working, as well as the checkboxes here in a bit. So let's go ahead and run it again, and we'll go dog list, do edit, and here we have our radio buttons. It's pretty straightforward. It's just like writing normal radio buttons in HTML, but allowing MVC to do some of the work on your behalf is definitely good. Here we have all of our data val HTML5, and automatically put in the gender for us and put in the values that we require. So that's pretty straightforward, and if we look at the checkboxes, they should be in line with how they are typically written just in standard HTML. Here we have our checkboxes. Again, we have all of our HTML5 data vals for our requirements, and our other logic that is wired up to our unobtrusive JavaScript. Definitely a bunch of good stuff here. So let's go back and let's take a look at our create page here. So like I mentioned before, there's several ways to actually write your different types of fields. The most common way to write your fields are going to be using editor for model dot whatever, like ID you could have. So that's the most common for strings. If you need specific stuff like checkboxes, it would be HTML.checkbox for, very similar to the text box for and so forth. So moving down here, as you can see, here's how we have set up the radio buttons. So underneath here we have the other way of writing radio buttons. Here's the strongly typed up here where we're specifying the actual property name from our model, and we're passing in the default value that we want for that particular radio button. Underneath here, though, we have commented out is the other way of writing it, which is not using the for property. Here we just have html.radio button. We're specifying the name that we want and then our default value. And essentially, radio button here and the radio button up here for gender or female will render equivalently the same thing. And they also, again, here we're specifying the same property of gender and specifying male. And this will tie the two together, as well as these two up here would be tied together based on the model of gender. So if we scroll down just a little bit more, we'll see our checkbox. And again, just like our radio buttons, we're using checkbox 4, and we're binding it to the model of spade for this one. And again, the other equivalent here is just checkbox with manually typing in the word sprayed. Now, if we wanted to pass in a default value, say for instance of that checkbox, like if we wanted it to be checked, as you see, the IntelliSense says it's looking for a Boolean for is checked, so we could say true. So then that would be checked automatically on our create. So if we want to see that, we can simply just go to our create here. That's already up and refresh. And then you can see that spade is already checked. So let's go back. And the reason why there are two checkboxes, just in case you were wondering, is because I actually left the other one uncommented, so I actually had two. So if I just, for sake of argument, just uncomment or comment out the other one and save. Can hit refresh, and you can see that there's only one checkbox there. So that is an example of the checkboxes in MVC. And overall, MVC forms are pretty straightforward. If you're used to doing HTML forms and you understand what these HTML helpers are trying to do and how they render out, you will get the hang of it, and it'll just become like second nature to you. So the last one that we're going to kind of look at here, actually the last two, first one is our drop-down list. Now this is very common when you have like a list of categories or other things like that. Here we actually have a drop-down list for handedness, which in terms of the dogs, like if they don't run straight, sometimes they can hook to the left or hook to the right. And obviously, if you got sled dogs and you have two rows, you don't want a dog that runs to the left on the right, because then he's going to run into one of the other dogs and kind of slow you down. So you don't want that. So anyways, here we have a drop-down list for. We're binding it to the handedness property of our dog model. And here we're doing something where we're actually passing in a list from our controller, which is view data here for handed list. You could also use a view bag, like viewbag.handedList if you want to make that. And lastly, we're actually passing in a fake property where you use like select one. In this case, we're saying choose one of the dogs, and that would be inserted above the actual list of dogs. So where that comes into place, here we see handedness and we see choose one. So you can select that. You see left, right, or none, and that is actually originating from our dog controller. So let's hop to that. Let's look at our dog controller here. We'll go down to create. So here we have our view data of handed list being created, and we are selecting the handed and value and text, and that is actually coming from this private method right here, which is creating a new list of selected items. And here we have left, right, and none. Again, so it's being passed to the view data, which then is passed down to our view. We're instantiating it as a select list, and then again we're adding the default value of choose one there. So then this is our effect. Choose one and then left, right, none. The last thing that we're going to look at is our actual text area. So this is a multi-line text box that is created. Here we're doing the strong typing of binding it to our model.notes. And then we have additional parameters that we can pass in. So at its bare bones, we have text box or text area for model and model.notes. So that's all you need essentially just to blurt out a text area for a model. But we have extended properties here, which the text area actually takes, so you can actually control the columns and the rows. Here we have the rows are highlighted. Next are the actual columns, so left to right, that are in place. And then lastly is any HTML attributes that we want to do here. The equivalent way of writing this, if you're not binding it specifically to a model, is you pass in the name of the element that you want. Here we want notes. This is a default value. And here again we have the number of rows and the number of columns, and then here are special HTML attributes for it. So what you end up with for this, I'm going to look at our create view again. What you end up is 40 columns wide by 5 rows deep, and that is what we end up with our notes. So hopefully this has been a good example of using some of the HTML elements within a form within MVC.